Welcome to Changeling Gaming. Today we're going to be talking about how... The first question to answer is, what is an engine building game? In short, an engine building game is any game where resources or upgrades are purchased that increase the productive abilities or options the player has at their disposal in order to work towards their objectives. Oftentimes this means either finding new synergies to combine or goals that are impossible to reach without acquiring certain resources first. This includes any game where you build a deck of cards through purchasing new cards on your turn, but those games will have their own video at a later date. There are many games that may not be entirely about engine building, but that still have engine building elements. Basically, any game that allows a player to acquire components that improve their capabilities for future turns has elements of engine building. This includes games like Splendor, Wingspan, Barrage, Evolution Climate, and Radlands. There are two main strategies that often arise from these kinds of games, that I like to think of as the slim and focus build, or the go wide build. The slim but effective build is meant to more or less be the fewest purchases possible for the greatest possible end result. It is usually only possible to master once a player has a thorough and deep understanding of the game they are playing or similar games, because they are deliberately not acquiring many resources and need to be very precise with the few tools they decide to pick up. Oftentimes, this means waiting for the right resource, or spending more on those few key pieces. By contrast, the go-wide approach means that the player is just trying to acquire as many resources as possible and is willing to lose some efficiency in favor of sheer volume, overwhelming in terms of the value being acquired. In this instance, the player is just looking for more resources, because each of those resources makes it easier to get more resources and the self-fulfilling loop begins. The poster child for this kind of game is Splendor, wherein there are usually two key paths players tend to take. The first time players pick up the game, they will often purchase cheaper gem cards, and get enough of them that more of the cheap gem cards can be acquired for free, and then more expensive cards for free, slowly working their way up the tree with one free purchase after another until they have achieved victory. This strategy usually finds it easy to acquire several noble tiles as well. Alternatively, players can decide to purchase only cards that are worth points, using a couple of tier 2 cards to get enough discounts to afford the tier 3 cards, and then purchasing enough of those to rapidly reach the final point total. With a slim selection of cards, most often it is impossible for players to get a noble using this strategy, or they might be able to acquire a single noble to push their points over the finish line. Deciding what the correct components are for an engine can be a daunting prospect, especially in games where there are a multitude of different options for what pieces to use to build that engine. Generally speaking, you're looking for components that will give back more than what you put into them, either in the engine activation or points at the end of the game. Which components are the most valuable for an engine depends very much on the game, and what core strategy is being applied, since most engine builders have different archetypes of engine that can be built within them. If considering the typical go-wide strategy, the individual components will ideally have cheaper costs to play, or are based upon a resource that your engine is easily able to produce. But if going for a more precise line of play, those components will be more expensive, but should be either ideal fits for the engine, or be worth many more resources or points the longer it remains in play. The key to the more focused build is to pick elements to acquire that synergize with each other. Often this takes the form of one component generating the resource that another component needs to consume. Pairing components together is ultimately the core intrigue of an engine building game, and while some pairings are quite logical, it is by testing out different combinations that the game truly becomes interesting, as within them there are often several different ways to achieve the same objectives. In Wingspan, to go wide and fill the board with as many birds as you can requires birds that are slightly less expensive to play, and will ideally generate the resources to help place other birds. In addition to building out as many birds as possible that generate resources, some birds should be played that will also generate points, and these should ideally be placed somewhere where they can all be activated together for the most value. If going for a slimmer approach, then the goal becomes to find birds whose abilities complement each other fantastically, like producing the specific resource that another bird wants to consume, and generate points every single time. The goal here would be to acquire several birds that work together like this, or some other synergy, so that by the end of the game, you would be using the same action to generate a substantial number of points every round. In engine building games, there is one very vital resource that does remain consistent, and that is taking actions during your turn. In most of these games, players have a limited number of turns or resources in which to accomplish their actions in the first place. This is especially vital in games where certain actions can be blocked off by other players who want to use the same abilities. In games where the total number of actions are limited, you ideally never want to take an action that does not have some beneficial result. Choosing to spend a turn drawing a card that you're hoping will give you what you need is more often than not going to be a waste of that turn. Instead, the focus should be on always looking for an action that will either give you the resources you need for a later turn, or begin running the incomplete engine to gain what you can from its activation. In games where some key actions are limited and shared across all players, be prepared to preemptively jump on certain key action spaces rather than waiting to fully optimize your turn in order to guarantee the vital resources or goods that that particular space provides. This is also true if the game provides only a limited count of certain resources, in which case, efficiently acquiring as many of those necessary resources as possible is the vital step. Take Barrage, where every player has a limited number of engineers to spend to accomplish their goals, and most of the actions are from a board where the first player to take an action does so for fewer engineers or fewer coins. This creates a rush where every player wants to take certain key actions before other players can, but while also not throwing away their vital engineers to complete actions that are only mildly effective. On the other hand, a game like Radlands has an even more limited pool of resources to use on any given turn, and discarding cards for their junk effects effectively grants the player some limited extra actions that they can use. But since water is also largely equivalent to the actions they have available, cards like the Muse that give the player an extra water on their turn are equivalent to receiving an extra action, which allows the player to build on that value with other cards, acquired with those vital water token actions. Now knowing what we do about selecting engine components and the efficiency of our actions, the question becomes, how do we gather the resources necessary to build the engine components, and in what order do we want to build them? As previously mentioned, ideally every action has gained resources that can be used in an efficient manner to build the engine components necessary to craft the desired engine itself, and now we must utilize them. Just as with our actions, we ideally want to minimize the losses from our resource expenditure, unless expending additional resources will provide a greater net benefit in the long run than holding on to them does. So what do we acquire first? Generally, the best choice is the component that can be used to acquire the next component. If this is not immediate, then the next consideration is for whether acquiring one component increases the value of our other actions, making our resource acquiring turns more efficient. If we can use one component to gain more resources, then the more plentiful resources will allow us to build the next engine components. The decision-making also changes as the game progresses. Earlier on, it is important to spend resources on engine pieces that will provide more value over the course of the game, and less important to acquire expensive point-based pieces. While at the end of the game, these value pieces become less important, and components that are more points-focused become the goal. Let's take Wingspan again. Early in the game, we ideally want to build various cheap birds into our different habitats to improve the core actions of each of those habitats, unless we're able to acquire a bird in one habitat whose ability functions like that of another habitat. For instance, birds in the grasslands or wetlands that produce food, birds that let us draw cards outside of the wetlands, and birds that lay eggs when we take actions outside of the grasslands. If we can make one area of our board obsolete, then we can acquire two types of resources in one row, which is more efficient than having to switch back and forth. In addition, some of these cards that gain us resources can also gain us points, and landing some of those early on can prove very valuable in the long run. In general though, birds that generate more resources are less useful in the long run, as opposed to birds who are worth more points, or that lay eggs on multiple other birds, since eggs are also worth points. Worth noting as well is that some games, like Barrage, have boards that grant incomes or other options when certain spaces are uncovered. In these games, deciding which of these actions are worth uncovering early are vital to increasing your available resources in later turns. Most engine building games involve building your own engine and continuing to work on that without input from your fellow players, working towards the resources you want as you go. However, some games have the players build engines that can or must interact with each other directly and disrupt the other players' engines. In a game where this interaction is necessary, then feel free to dive in with the danger and be aggressive. That is the point. Sometimes though, when this interaction is optional, check the feelings of the table and try to respect what the other players are looking for. Some disruption might be fine, but annihilating a player's engine who's either struggling or just having fun might not go over very well. In a game where engine disruption is necessary or how the rest of the table is playing the game, finding where to strike for maximum devastation is the most important aspect. Try to find the most important element or elements to your opponent's engine. Usually these will be the components that either spark cascading beneficial effects or have actions or effects that the player returns to often. The more often an ability is used, the more important it is to the engine that your opponent has built. A game where the aggression is required is Radlands, where destroying your opponent's camps is the goal of the game. A game where conflict is frequent but not required is Evolution Climate, wherein players have the option to create a carnivore that eats the other species that are present, but which species depends on the vibe of the table as a whole for a good board game playing experience. Regardless, to disrupt the engines, in the case of Radlands, search for which cards get activated frequently or whose abilities activate other cards. For Evolution Climate, there is usually one species that will start a food gathering train from the watering hole. Limiting what they can consume will slow down the rest of the species. Or it can become a game of predator versus predator, trying to undercut the sharing of food. What have we learned today? Well, there's multiple different ways to approach any good engine building game, and any number of different engines to build. When we're crafting our own engines, we want to focus on figuring out what those key components are and acquiring them as efficiently as possible, playing value cards early in the game and points-based cards to win with later in the game, unless the value is only acquired over time, at which point, play them early. And finally, when trying to decide how to disrupt an opponent's engine, look at which cards they activate often and which cards have effects that allow the rest of the engine to operate. Good luck and happy engine building. If you want to learn more about what we do, check out the links in the description, and if you want to join our community and support the work we do, you can find our Patreon there as well. Subscribe so you can learn when more videos are coming out. Thank you for watching, and remember, keep changing, keep gaming, have fun.